Hello and welcome to Privacy by Design, Exceeding Customer Expectations. This is a session all about privacy, but it's not about technical matters such as a first-party data strategy or measurement issues. This is all about customer expectations. And it should feel like very familiar territory for all of you, because even though you're all marketers for one or maybe a few companies, you are customers of a great many companies. And you have expectations about how those companies interact with you and treat you. My name is Johnny, and I lead the insights team for Google in the UK and also our privacy research across Europe. And we've done a great deal of research about this topic with Ipsos, the research agency, over the past few years. So a question to begin with: what percentage of internet users do you think feel they have complete control over the disclosure and the removal of their data online? It's not very many, it's only 3%. And now this is a very strong statement. This is about feeling in complete control. And this is about both the disclosure and removal of their data online. But it is still, nonetheless, a very small percentage. And when we look at how participants feel about the way the companies use their data in marketing, more than 2/3 of them feel skeptical. So there's a big difference here in how we are performing as marketers in terms of the experiences that we are delivering and our own expectations, if we're a representative group, of how customers feel about how their data should be used. Time for a thought experiment. So how many companies do you share your data with? Is it dozens, perhaps hundreds, or even thousands? Think of all those companies that you have some type of long-term, long-running relationship with. They might be banks or utilities or mobile network providers and many other categories like those. They might be companies who you recently bought something from, an online retailer, for example. Think of all the apps on your phone. Think of all the companies whose websites you visited and then accepted cookies or gave an email address and have seen more communications from them more recently. Think of all the subscriptions you have, maybe to a loyalty scheme or to a gym or to a dating app, perhaps. These all add up to a great number of different companies with whom you have some relationship and have shared some data or contact details. And when we think about the topic of privacy, we tend to think it in different ways depending on whether we're thinking it in a very broad context or in a very narrow situational context. In order to understand this nuance more, we started off in our research by taking a small number of people on a very intensive 5-week journey of discovery. So we started by doing individual in-depth interviews with these people and understanding what their current perceptions were and their current behaviors were when it came to the topic of online privacy. We then asked them to go away for a week and do what we call a self-led data audit. So we asked them to look at all of the emails coming into their inbox, all of the postal mail coming through their mailbox, all of any phone calls they received from companies, and think about the relationship they have with that company, how and when they began that relationship or they began to share data with that company. We then interviewed them again to see have their perceptions on this topic shifted from when we're thinking about it in a very broad context to in a much more grounded context and with all of these different individual company relationships in mind. And then we know that people talk about this topic quite differently depending on whether it's in a one-to-one environment or more of a group environment when there's a certain social pressure to say the right thing or have the smart answer. So we put all of our respondents into groups to see how they talked about this topic with each other. And then we left them a little while and came back and asked them, has this experience actually changed the way that you think about privacy and the way that you share data with whom and so on? And that was a precursor to then a much larger study that we did with Ipsos again, where we talked to more than 7,000 people across UK, France, Germany, and the Netherlands. And we put together all the results of that big quantitative study into a report called Privacy by Design, Exceeding Customer Expectations, which you can see a glimpse of here, and I'll share the link to at the end. That report contains all the detailed data and charts and so on. What I'm going to share with you is the highlights, the key findings, the key principles from the research. And we and Ipsos were really delighted that this research recently picked up an award for Best International Media Research Project at the Mediatel Awards. So what did we find? Well, overall, we found that there are 3 key opportunities for brands, and they are to make it meaningful, make it memorable, and make it manageable. And we call these three principles the three M's, and I'm going to talk to you about each one of them in turn. First up, making it meaningful. So, what for you makes sharing data with a company meaningful? Quite a difficult question to answer. It's not typical consumer language, nor is something like creating a value exchange, which is very much marketing language. Not many people say, oh, well, I entered into a relationship with a company because I wanted to enter a value exchange. They say, what's in it for me? And the reason we use the word meaningful rather than say valuable is because actually we found that it wasn't always about monetary value. There are other ways that brands could offer people a meaningful value that was non-monetary. Their expectations are very high, and your expectations as customers are all probably very high as well. You not only expect brands to understand your interests in general and use that information that you provided in a very sophisticated way, but also to reach them in the right moment, not bother them when it's the wrong moment. As this rather model respondent said, being there in the right context and moment is key. So what do we mean when we say we could offer meaningful value in ways that are more than just monetary discounts? Well, we could offer people things that are tailored to their interests. So for example, we had one respondent who had shared her waist size and height with an online clothing company. And they'd then use that to suggest clothes to her that she wouldn't otherwise have looked at. That for her had meaningful value. There's about being there in the right moment. One of our respondents said that it was very useful that their insurance provider sent them a reminder email before their renewal was due and suggested some different offers that were available to them based on their circumstances. We had someone who said that saving them time or money was particularly valuable. For example, they would remember their airline had remembered their family size, budget, and preferred destinations, which had saved her time when planning her next family's trip away. And also meaningful value could be educational or entertaining content. So we had someone who had bought a piece of art from an art dealer and actually particularly enjoyed after that receiving emails about the world of art from that art dealer. They found those educational and entertaining. And perhaps unsurprisingly, we find that as people get closer to making a purchase, the more in market they are, the more they find the personalized messages, communications from brands to be both relevant and the more positive they feel about them, showing that being there in the right time and right context is important as well as offering that value. So that's about making it meaningful, and that means making sure you can answer the question in a very conclusive way to a customer, what's in it for them. The second of our M's, the second of our principles is make it memorable. And what do we mean by that? Well, let's go back to our earlier question of how many companies do you share data with? Maybe you already have a figure in mind. Now, how many of those companies do you remember agreeing to share your data with? Is it most of them, half of them, just a few of them? Probably not all of them, that's for sure. And then how do you feel when you hear from companies you don't remember sharing your data with? So perhaps ones that you did, but you don't recall. What we found, if you're anything like our respondents, is that you tended to feel more positive hearing from companies that you remembered to share your details with rather than ones that you didn't recall sharing your details with. And that's because people want brands to be open and honest when collecting that information and when using it later. And importantly, it's not just about gathering or collecting or logging consent or permission from the perspective of the customer. It's about the customer remembering that. And that's quite different. So what this implies is that actually there's benefit in reminding people of what information they've shared, where, when, how, why it was that they did that, and making sure they're reminded of that over time. But there's not a one-size-fits-all here. It really depends on the circumstances. So the best way to think about this is probably put yourself in your customer's shoes. How recently did they provide that consent? What's the nature of the relationship? Are you a company who they interact with frequently? Do they have a close relationship? Would they assume that, yes, I'm sure I did share my information with them at some point? That makes sense. Do you communicate with them often or only very infrequently? If it's not very often and it was a long time ago and you don't have that much relationship, probably you want to go back and remind that person about the time they consented and why. Whereas if you have more of an ongoing relationship, then you maybe don't want to go over the top. What we found is that there was a 7% increase in the perceived relevance of ads when people actively shared their contact information, in this case provided an email address, they then felt more positive about the relevance of the communications coming from that brand, all other things being equal. And there are some simple techniques listed here, which I think are just table stakes really, for how you can help make things memorable, explaining how and why data is used, making sure to collect no more than necessary, and so on. But the really important insight that this research showed is that beyond all of these things that really are table stakes, actually making it memorable, making sure that people remember doing that and they feel confident that they shared their data, not just they had shared their data, is really important. The third of our M's, and the final one, is making it manageable. So a question for you again. How often do you change your own data sharing settings and preferences? And the answer is perhaps not that often, and it very much depends on the company and the circumstances. In my own case, I was thinking about the last time I did this, it was a food delivery app, which was just sending me too many messages that weren't that relevant, but I still wanted to get some messages from them, just not as many and as poorly targeted ones as I was getting. But it's quite rare for me. And this topic of having controls and privacy in general is a good example of something called a say-do gap. And in research, we call something a say-do gap when what people say they do and what they actually do are quite different. This leads to some quite interesting confused beliefs and some contradictory behaviors. And as researchers, it makes this an interesting topic because we really need to get under the skin of why people would say they do one thing rather than another. And what people say is they want control over their data. They want to exercise control over their preferences and settings and so on. What we might see in practice is that people don't do that all that frequently. So does that mean that controls don't matter and offering those controls is unnecessary? Certainly not, because what we find is that actually people want to know that they can change those settings and preferences should they want to. The fact that they don't use those controls all of the time does not mean that those controls are not valuable. So really what we're talking about here is something emotional. It's about a feeling of control rather than actually exercising control. And that's the important thing to make sure you have with your customers. Providing actual controls is really table stakes. So if you're not already, obviously you must be offering tools for customers to manage their data choices, to opt in and out marketing, and to adjust the frequency of marketing communications and so on. So what do the 3 M's achieve? If you follow these 3 key principles that we've outlined today that reflect the high expectations of consumers and the sophisticated ways they expect you to use their data, then you will be making it meaningful. You will be providing some meaningful value to people. And it doesn't necessarily have to be discounts or offers and money off. It can be other things as well, like time saving, educational content or entertainment content. You'll be making it memorable, which means that not only do you know that someone did consent to share data and exactly what that data was and when, but also that they recall that they feel confident that they did that at a certain point in time and they know why. Thirdly, you'll be making it manageable. And that means offering ways that people can control their preferences and their settings and so on, but not just that, making sure that they are actually aware of those things, even if they don't appear to be using them. It's the awareness of those tools that counts for a great deal. And if you do all 3 of these things, well, you create a sense of control, a feeling of control. And that's really important. It's an emotional thing. It's a feeling. What does that feeling deliver in terms of marketer? Well, we know that has an upside in terms of customers. We want them to feel in control and have all of those things. But as marketer, there's a benefit too, because we found that people are 3 times more likely to react positively to advertising when they feel in control of their data. They also found ads from those brands where they felt in control to be twice as relevant to them. So this suggests that actually doing the right thing by the consumer is also doing the right thing for your company. And that it's not the case that privacy and performance necessarily need to be at odds with each other. They can both be there at the same time. So thank you very much for listening to Privacy by Design. I hope you will go out and exceed all of your customers' expectations. And if you would like to get hold of the full report, you can find it by following this link or scanning this QR code. Thank you.